our panel tonight is called Privacy Quarantined. Is it quarantined? Are we all giving up a lot of our freedoms because we all want to be safe from a pandemic? Is there material that needs to be taken down? And we have a great lineup of people to talk about this from Facebook and ORF's partner for tackling insurgent ideologies. It's Public Policy Director in India, Ankhi. Thank you so much, Ankhi, for making the time for this conversation tonight. We have Ashish Jaiman, who is the Director of Technology Operations at Microsoft. We have Sugarman, who is the Director of the Cyber Initiative at the William and Flora Hewitt Foundation. And we have Rita Singh, who is an Associate Professor at Carnegie Mellon University, whose work I personally admire a lot. I think she should give us all presentations on deepfake technologies and voice manipulation. If nothing else, we'll go away certainly entertained and better informed as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Arjun Jayakumar, who's a colleague of mine at ORF as well, who deals with all these issues and is best placed to take this discussion forward. Thank you all. I know you're in varied time zones across the world, but it's been a great pleasure and we're glad that you can join us. Arjun, over to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Maya, for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here curating this discussion among such a distinguished group of speakers. So just to set a bit more of context for the discussion, I think it goes without saying that the coronavirus pandemic has led to some radical changes in the way that we are living our lives today. So in our attempts to contain the disease, technology has quickly become an integral part of public health responses worldwide, and new applications like contact tracing as well as existing ones like facial recognition are being liberally used to track the spread of the disease, to monitor compliance with quarantine norms, and to identify clusters of diseases and so on. So valuable as these capabilities are, the large-scale collection and monitoring of data has also given rise to some concerns about their short and long-term impact on individual rights like privacy and freedom of expression. For instance, questions like how do we prevent disease surveillance from turning into a slippery slope and ending with the normalization of mass surveillance is something that we're grappling with. And on a related note, how do we keep the digital sphere, which has become a bastion for free and open discourse, from being compromised by measures taken against, say, online misinformation? So these are just some of the questions that we're hoping to tackle today with the help of our excellent panelists. And this promises to be a very engaging and informative discussion. But before I move to the panelists for their opening statements, just a quick reminder for those who are listening in today that we will be taking questions at the end of the discussion. So please feel free to use the box beneath your screen to enter your questions, and we will get to them in the final 15 or 20 minutes of this discussion as time permits. So with that, I would now like to turn to the panel and invite the panelists to make their opening statements, addressing, if you would, your assessment of how the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of influenced the global surveillance apparatus, and what are some of the challenges that you see when it comes to protecting rights like privacy and free speech on the internet. So can I first call upon Ms. Ankhi, who is the Director of Public Policy for India, South and Central Asia at Facebook, to make your opening statements. Over to you, Ankhi.
Thank you, Arun. I think all of us recognize how serious the pandemic is. In fact, just about 10 days back, we had an incident in our neighborhood, and I, along with my family, we underwent COVID testing ourselves. Luckily, we all tested negative, but it was very close home. It's no longer a statistic which you read in the newspapers or in digital media. It's here and now. So different countries are dealing with different techniques in terms of making sure that they are testing and also tracing. So test and trace is something which is becoming almost an important governance tool in terms of disease control. Obviously, I mean, it raises some important questions in terms of what are the underlying governance principles which can be and should be used in terms of making sure that this does not generate the type of surveillance practices which we know are not, sort of privacy enhancing at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Has quite the opposite effect. The most important dimensions which we have seen is that different countries have used different types of contact tracing approaches. As a company, as Facebook, we have certain views on contact tracing. We do understand that there are different techniques which would be used. For example, the most pervasive, sort of a method which has been used is Bluetooth handshakes across devices through apps, through contact tracing apps. There are also other apps which use a combination of Bluetooth as well as GPS, and we've seen some of those apps here in our country as well. Insofar as we are concerned, as Facebook is concerned, we think that every country has their own social realities. It has its own approach to public health, and some of these strategies are grounded in those types of considerations. But germane to whatever route a country takes, I think it's important to recognize that there are certain underlying principles which have to be followed in terms of implementation of some of these practices to test and trace. And essentially, there are 6 or 7 principles which are governing. You could consider them to be governing principles in terms of how these should be thought of. Whatever contact tracing app is out there should definitely have principles of data minimization. There has to be purpose limitation. Consent is extremely important in terms of how the user health status information will be collected, how will it be stored, how will it be shared. Transparency around that is again another very, very important principle which people should be aware of. And it should be voluntary. All contact tracing apps, in terms of its applicability, they're inbuilt into the consent principle is a voluntary use, right? It has to be a more of a voluntary adoption of an application if a user wants to use it, and obviously backed with the appropriate amount of integrity and security architecture, which should be supporting these kind of applications. From our perspective, we've had some engagements and some interactions in this area of fighting the pandemic, and there of course have been various implementations across a range of programmatic partners. But in the area of working with public health authorities as well as agencies, insofar as data is concerned, we have a Data for Good program where we worked with pretty well-known Indian academic and research institutions to make disease maps available to these academic institutions, who then have in turn worked with the COVID control rooms of various state governments, particularly in the states of Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu and Orissa. And for instance, when initially the lockdown was announced, some of these data maps were used to see how lockdown rules were being, the migration methods were showing where the government should be securing a supply response, because obviously people were going from one place to the other, and therefore both in terms of a health response as well as in terms of the material response, those pre-positioning of supplies had to be organized. So our understanding is that aggregated anonymized data sets which we worked with the academic institutions were very useful to the state governments in terms of disease control and disease response as mass migrations were happening. That has been our experience. The second experience, which we have had some exposure to in a privacy protected way, is in the area of manual contact tracing, because we think that is a valuable way in terms of helping disease prevention and disease spread. There are state governments that we have partnered with, which has used our jobs tool to recruit health workers, frontline health workers, so that they can do the test and trace, the door-to-door activation, which you are seeing in many parts of our country here in India, which is happening. So we have seen that in those two experiences, the implementations have happened in a privacy protected manner, and something which is consistent with the principles which we would like to see happening more. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ankhi, for those comments. I think it's a good point that right now we're in a situation where we need to be relying on technology means to sort of track and trace the applications, so the disease that is spreading across the world, but we should still adhere to certain baseline norms and standards which make sure that the any infringements of rights that's happening is done in a proportional manner, and it doesn't sort of cross that threshold of proportionality. So I think that's a point very well taken. Now can I move on to Mr. Ashish Jaiman, who is the director of technology operations at Microsoft, to make some brief opening statements. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Arun, and I'm so glad that I'm participating here. Grateful to you and the esteemed panelists. And again, my objective here is not just to share my opinions and thoughts, but also learn from all of you, right? So I'm Ashish Jaiman. I'm the Director of Tech and Operations in Customer Security and Trust Organization. And our focus is to our focus is mostly on cybersecurity and improving cybersecurity posture. And we feel that disinformation, misinformation actually is the next, it's equivalent to cybersecurity threat, in fact. And, at Microsoft, we believe in the timeless value of privacy. And as a global tech company, we do take a lot of pride in our focus to preserve the ability of our customers' data. And have control of their own data and privacy on our platform. So when we think about privacy, we actually have a well-documented six guiding principles, which form the foundation of our approach to privacy, as well as it continues to shape the way we build our platforms and services. And they are like control, transparency, security, legal protections, and no content-based targeting, as well as whatever we do with the data, obviously with your consent, is to improve your experience in our platform. So I want to now go back to what our purpose of this discussion is, which is as we see, and Ankhi actually put it out very beautifully, is like it has to be a collaborative effort at the end of the day, right? The governments, public health authorities, healthcare industry, as well as tech platforms, we are all working together in concert to identify a path forward to bring the society back to normalcy. And the core work streams are tracking individuals. Essentially, if you think about the work streams, you can actually think about three things that we do. Tracking individuals who are infected. So that's one work stream that everyone should focus on or is focusing on. Tracing those who have been in contact or physical contact with the people who are either have infected. And the third thing is making testing available and within the reach of people who actually need it. So we have joint nation states across the globe, institutions with a very shared mission to develop solutions. And again, the solutions would fall into tracking, tracing, and testing, as I said. Now, from a pandemic perspective, if you think about these three areas or three work streams, all the technological solutions that would take part in these three work streams involve collection and use of personal data, right? Healthcare data, geolocation data, proximity, adjacent data, and the other important thing is identifiable contacts, right? So if I have some symptoms, then the whole idea of tracing is that the people who are in contact with me can be identified and then be traced. So what we did is we actually at the beginning of this process, somewhere in February, in March, April timeframe, we said, hey, what should be the guiding principles apart from what we already have, like 6 guiding principles of privacy, but what should be our guiding principles that we can offer to our customers and healthcare authorities who actually are collectively trying to figure this out. And those 6 principles, and some of them actually align very well with what Ankhi and Facebook are doing. The first one is obtain meaningful consent. Right, so consent, but make it meaningful. Be very specific on what are the reasons you are actually getting that consent from the users or customers. Any data that is collected for this issue area should only be for public health purposes. Right, so you can actually go back to them for any other reason. But if you're focusing on this, let's just make sure that the collected data is only used for public health purposes. Collect the minimum amount of data, which again reiterates what Ankhi just said. Also provide users and customers a choice on where their data is stored, right? So again, not every solution would use Microsoft technology. So our goal was to actually publish something that the customers or the industry can use as well, is to provide choices to the users. Do not share their data without consent, right? So that's another thing, right? As a platform, if the solution is using Microsoft platform, the customer can use, but we want to make sure that if they are allowing other entities to look into that data, there has to be not only a consent, but also right kind of safeguards around that data. And the last thing I'll say is delete the data as soon as it is not needed for this particular emergency, right? So those are like 7 guiding principles that we published, and we take privacy very, very seriously. And again, the data of the customer is their data. And in this infodemic world or pandemic world, tracking, tracing, and testing, all that actually should be driven by these 7 principles that we are proposing.
Thank you, Ashish, for that. I think, again, what is coming through is that when we're using technology solutions to track and trace the pandemic in these difficult times, we should still be adhering to these baseline principles, which also align very well with the conventional principles of data protection, like informed consent and data minimization and purpose limitation and so on. So I think that's the baseline that we should be going with, basically. Again, like a very good point. So now can I come to Mr. Eli Sugarman, who is the director of the Cyber Initiative at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, to make your opening remarks. Over to you, Eli.
Thank you, Arjun, and thank you to Samir, Maya, and the entire ORF team for inviting me to participate this morning, my time, evening yours. I think over the last 4 months or so, we've witnessed how COVID-19 is really highlighting, and in some cases exacerbating, underlying tensions around surveillance throughout the world. We've seen mistrust of technology companies really reach a crescendo for many reasons, including around contact tracing apps and widespread COVID-related dis and misinformation. And I think I really appreciate Ankhi and Ashish's comments, and I think it's wonderful to hear such thoughtful frameworks from 2 leading companies like Facebook and Microsoft. I think 2 other companies, though, who aren't on the panel are worth mentioning, Apple and Google, who, as everybody knows, have made some interesting changes to their operating system and published a standard that's being used pretty widely for exposure notification apps. And I think the most important point there is that the architecture they've developed is not actually designed really to do exactly what governments and states want, right, with real contact tracing. On the other hand, it's meant to really empower the user and to help alert people to contact their health department if the user has been in proximity to others who may have been, exposed to COVID, right? And so from that perspective, I think it's interesting that to draw on the principles that Ankhi and Ashish highlighted, the point of that effort really seems to be to give the user the power and to protect them and ensure their privacy and security, data is stored locally, so on and so forth. And so just to say that, I think some of the emerging, more dominant technical frameworks actually do a much better job than in the past of ensuring privacy and preventing abuse. And I think, there are, of course, a wealth of other apps that don't use the Apple Google framework in Australia, Singapore, all around the world. And so, but just to say that it is somewhat rare and heartening to see security and privacy driving the architecture of some of these dominant new applications, because that isn't always the way that new technology is developed, as we all know. I think, though, that the mistrust of government is something that's worth highlighting, right? And that's driving some of the apprehension around surveillance, contact tracing, and the like. I think you all know there are reports of abuse already by law enforcement officials in the United States, take my country, that have described their investigative work in tracking protesters as contact tracing. And I think that's an example of the kind of surveillance abuse that we're concerned about. It's really driven by lack of trust. And there's lack of trust because, to the previous panelist points, there are not clear laws and policies governing who can access the data that is being gathered for public health purposes and why. At least that's the case in many states in the United States. And so the lack of clarity there about laws and policies is driving concern and mistrust, understandably. I think one other point worth mentioning is that, as in many things, these issues impact people and communities differently. At least in the U.S., elderly and minority communities are the most likely to be impacted by COVID-19 and the least able to purchase new and secure devices and make use of some of the applications being developed to help promote public health. And so inequity is something here that I think we need to be very aware of. And that's another theme with surveillance, that surveillance impacts people differently. And so here, that's the same thing. And I think just to close with, I think many of these problems are to be expected, right? Trying to rush and confront a privacy-sensitive digital technology and new application in a rushed manner is very fraught. But I do think that the public health imperative requires us to keep pushing hard and to keep having these conversations. And I would say that, I think one topic we'll get to is something that's related but different, which is sort of the infodemic, as has been referred to, or disinformation. I think it's going to be interesting to explore how, in our respective democracies, what happens when perhaps certain authority figures and political parties in power are the ones who are the source of that disinformation and misinformation that is then impacting how people use or don't use contact tracing and or other new technologies that are hopefully being developed. So I'll stop there, and thank you again for inviting me to participate.
Great. Thank you, Eli. I think that's a very interesting point that you bring up about, particularly about trust of the general public in these measures that's being put forward, and that you do basically need to consider measures to build trust between the government and the general public in order for these measures to be taken more seriously and be as effective as they can be. And I also really appreciate the point about disinformation and misinformation, which is again like a major pain point in this current coronavirus pandemic. But we'll come back to that point in a little bit. So can I now move to Ms. Rita Singh, who is an associate research professor at the Carnegie Mellon University, to make your opening statement. Over to you, ma'am. Ma'am, you'll have to unmute yourself. Yeah. At the bottom of your screen, I think there should be like a bar, and on the left there should be an unmute.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you, Arjun, and thank you, Arif, for inviting me to this very elite panel. Thank you, Ankhi, Ashish, and Eli, for your very provocative and thought-provoking statements just now. I would like to put a lot of the issues that we have been talking about in relation to privacy and technology in perspective by sharing a very personal story with you at this point. So for the past several years, my team and I have been engaged in developing the science of what I call profiling humans from their voice. And what that entails is deducing all sorts of personal parameters about the speaker from their voice. This has raised a lot of concerns from the community at large, and I mean the scientific and the general community across the world. It all came to a head when the pandemic began and we were in a lockdown. Back in February, we began working on a system that would be able to detect COVID signatures from voice. Now, at that time, we didn't have a lot of information about COVID, so it was based on a number of hypotheses that were formed based on our prior experience with upper respiratory illnesses and their signatures on voice. Nevertheless, we put together that system. It was an AI-based system. It was opened up to the public on the 27th of March. And what it was doing at the time was very carefully simply providing a rating on a scale of 1 to 10 of how likely a person is to have symptoms that match those of known COVID patients. And it was put up with all kinds of disclaimers in neon on the website. Day one, we got 20,000 contributors to the website. We were soliciting data and asking them to also try out the system at the same time. Day two, the system was brought down. by my university. It was brought down because people were not paying attention to the disclaimers, and the fear was that if they believed the system to be 100% true, it could lead to bad things. And not a lot of people, even in America, are very computer savvy or AI savvy, and they tend to believe any AI system that is put out there. Completely agree with that. But then it took 2 months, and even as of now, the legals to figure out how to put forward that kind of a system to the public without eliciting all kinds of repercussions. There were issues around privacy. What are do the data contain private information? How are we going to protect the data? There are all kinds of privacy laws in the United States, in Europe, which there are laws that give a person the right to be forgotten, which means that when we put out a system like that and solicit data from general speakers, we need to ensure that if they come back 10 years down the line and ask for their data to be deleted, we should be provably able to delete the data. That hampered the progress. Remember, on day one, we got data from 20,000 people. And that this kind of a set of shackles, so to speak, put around the technology by existing privacy laws and all of the legislation that we have around protection of citizen privacy came to bite us at the time of the pandemic. Had we been allowed to go forward and solicit data, collect data, show the results to the system, to the people, we would have had a working system that might have been, it would have definitely been at par with the medical testing system out there. It is non-invasive, it is instant. You can test yourself 10 times a day if you want to. It would have allowed, or at least made the process easier to for businesses and other entities to reopen. People could test themselves at home. Those who could not get to hospitals, those who did not have the means to go out, who feared to go out, could get themselves tested. What happened in this? So this is my story. What happened? What happened was that we didn't have a set of laws that were well thought out for a pandemic situation. We have a set of emergency laws when something politically goes wrong in a country. There's a civil war, there can be a state of emergency. When there is a terrorist attack, there can be a state of emergency, and so on and so forth. We have laws that we have created around the use of technology, and we continue to debate the issues of ethics. We continue to debate I'm sorry. Risha, can you please pick up the phone? I'm so sorry. Yes, where was I? We continue to debate the topics of ethics around technology, around AI. But I think we as a panel need to discuss what that even means. Because we cannot enforce ethics. We can come up with all kinds of do's and don'ts as related to ethics, but we cannot enforce them. What we can really enforce is what is in our law books. So how are these ethics going to make their way into the law books, especially when they are in the perspective of technology and new technology? How obstructive are our old legislations around technology, if any, that exist? Some of you are cyber experts. You know that there are no comprehensive laws in every country around cyber insecurity and cyber attacks and things like that, cyber crimes. The world community as a whole is struggling with coming up with cross-border legislations to deal with cyber crimes and other crimes that are related, like organized crimes that are carried out throughout the world by gangs. So there are so many issues that immediately came to light through this personal experience of mine, that I'm sitting here thinking, if we as a panel, as a whole, as a community, continue to talk about protecting people's privacy in the context of technology, at what point will it come back to bite us? is it worth it? Is it worth the prospect of losing something that could have helped humanity as a whole when the time comes? Should we have a different set of expectations of privacy when it comes to pandemic situations? I think we should. And so I will stop there, and I hope we can continue the discussion through this panel.
Great. Thank you so much, ma'am, for those very insightful comments and that anecdote. And the point that we should be looking at the existing legal frameworks and see if we have made enough provisions to sort of anticipate new technologies and allow them to function properly and as they should, so that we can derive as much value from it as we can. So coming back to Ankhi with a small question. So please feel free to respond to any of the points that have been raised by the other panelists also. But I also have a small question, which is that we've spoken about how we're building a lot of systems that gather data and that conduct some sort of digital surveillance on a scale that we haven't previously been doing before the pandemic. But so what happens like once the pandemic is over? So basically in the post-pandemic world, how do you think these infrastructures would sort of function, and do you think we need to look at dismantling these infrastructures that we have built up, or are we looking at finding secondary uses for such infrastructures, or how do you think the way forward should be?
So first of all, I think Rita has made some very, very provocative points, which we all should consider and examine. Because look, I think the COVID experience is an experience in terms of both its scale and also the huge human cost. I'm not even talking about the economic cost, but the huge human cost it has inflicted on communities, on nation states, etc., has been tremendous. Nobody has been prepared for something like this. This is an area where obviously legal systems, norms, even international legislation, the harmonization principles, etc., are all playing catch up. I think at some stage, forums like this, as well as sort of the global conversations which will happen around these things during the Internet Governance Forum, which is scheduled to happen in a few months' time, is going to examine some of these questions of trust. It all comes down fundamentally to the issue of digital trust and norm shaping, and whether there is a case to build some regulatory sandboxes for the type of new age technological innovation scenarios which Rita just talked about. I mean, just sitting here, hearing her speak in terms of the potential of something like this as a public good. So the definition of what is a public good, and therefore when you are kind of defining that, what is the kind of norms? I think norms have to precede before it gets translated in some kind of a legislation which will look into the governance of the issue of how do you use data insofar as it relates to the area of public health, because obviously the levels of protections, the rights, the consent architecture has to be fairly well thought out when you're looking into some of these new age technologies. But I also agree with her that if you are not able to absorb some amount of ambiguity as you are doing these trials, because you don't know what are the results that this is going to yield, and if the only lens which one is applying is the harm prevention lens, right? Like the abuse standard. If we do this, this is the kind of abuse that is going to happen. And if we are going to look at innovation only from the lens of applying an abuse standard, that is going to be limiting for innovators. So I can understand the arguments on the side of innovators and how frustrating it can be for them, because they kind of look at this complexity of both national legislation as well as global legislations. And of course, there's this question of legal authority, right? Both in terms of the domestic nexus as well as in terms of the international domain. So I do understand that can be very problematic. But I think forums like this, as well as forums like the Internet Governance Forum, as well as other international forums which are discussing these issues, for instance, the global DPA regulators meetings which happens, they should actively be examining the questions that what is the sandbox model which allows innovators to go and innovate without applying the principle of abuse standards as being the fundamental principle which they start thinking through when they are going and innovating this new age technologies for some unforeseen situations such as COVID definitely is. Insofar as, you know, the existing architectures which companies, other platforms have developed, etc., this is an emergency response. So when the moment you say emergency response, either you use existing tools for public education purposes so that people can teach themselves and keep themselves safe. That's one. And the second element is the preventive elements, which is where the test and trace options is what we are talking about. But again, there in terms of, I won't say dismantling, but I think embedded in that approach is this entire thing of purpose limitation, right? Use the data for very narrowly defined purposes for which it has been collected. And once the pandemic ends, that particular need for the use of that data set should also end. So that is the governing principle when you talk about the integrity of that particular data set, because you're collecting it for a specific purpose under narrow definitions, and making sure that there is appropriate governance practices which keeps the use to that narrowly defined area of application would be important.
Thank you for that, Ankhi. So now I'm just going to quickly move to the next panelist because we are running a little short on time as well. So I'll just come to Mr. Ashish with a question on misinformation, because I know that you've been doing some work on misinformation at Microsoft. So apart from any responses you have to the panelists already, I was just wondering if the work that you have done at Microsoft has sort of showed us any takeaways on how we can handle this ongoing misinformation pandemic, infodemic during this COVID crisis in such a way that we don't sort of end up doing any collateral censorship on legitimate content as well. So how do we handle this issue right now?
Yeah, thanks, Arun. I just want to quickly respond to what Ankhi and Rita said is, I don't think that if we were to actually think about what happens after pandemic, if we were to separate architecture and data, then we can actually have the architecture and the infrastructure in place. All we should think about is the data itself. So what do we do? So, I personally think that if the data is no longer needed and was you asked by the user, the consent was given for this particular use case, then we have the moral obligation to remove that data from our infrastructure. Right? The infrastructure can be repurposed in any other in any other architecture if needed in future. But I go back to your point, and I actually love what Katie Starbird from UW actually said, is that pandemic misinformation is even more contagious, right? That is, like, I love this line because, one thing that we have seen is that the misinformation, disinformation, especially at the beginning of pandemic, was by the virtue of what we call data voids, right? Whereas there is no authoritative source of data, so people actually start making stuff up, and then nefarious actors use that lack of data, the missing data, to inflict harm or for all their political or profit making, right? And the whole idea is the data, there is no authoritative data because we haven't seen this before, right? So that the whole idea of data voids, actually we saw very firsthand the implications of data void in March, April, May timeframe. We still see it, but those are like the very important times for data voids. Going back to disinformation itself, right, and in the work that we have been doing, right, one thing is, like, whenever we talk about disinformation, it's always about thinking about, hey, computational propaganda is used by totalitarian regimes, right? But if we come back to, it's very complex than that. It is not as simple as saying, hey, the nation state actors who are totalitarian would actually use disinformation to serve their agenda. The scale and speed that the internet and technology provides, a very small team running out of a very simple complex can actually do similar or even worse damage, right? You just have to actually trigger people's emotions, which again, I go back to the human tendency of being more activated by salacious and false and gossip than the truth, and that human tendency is exploited. We see it every day, right? So I come back to our learnings in last many months have been more about, hey, there are technological solutions. Yes, there could be, but Ankhi can tell you they're super hard, right? They're at the scale, maybe some technologists can understand, but that is very, very complex to say, hey, we found this misinformation, remove it or do something, right? At a scale that Facebook has or Twitter has or Google or Microsoft has, it's very impossible. So technological solutions do play a role, but they are not the only solution. We think about policy and regulation as well. They play a role, but going back to Rita's and Ankhi's point is, how do we actually create sensible regulations that don't stifle innovation, right? So you have to start thinking in that term. So they also play a role, but I don't think that's like a one-time solution. Technology, policy, regulations. What I also think is media literacy is actually a very important thing that we should talk about, and also make sure that we are doing the right things, both as platforms, but also as institutions, be it government or public or private institutions. Our learning has been that media literacy is very, very effective tool to fight disinformation, misinformation, right? If you empower people and give them right information, and now again, this goes back to data voice point, is who tells what the right and wrong is. But if you provide right kind of tools, give them information, consumers information, I think that becomes like the first principle. And then we start thinking about, hey, how can we implement in technology and regulation some of the countermeasures to disinformation or infodemic?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Ashish. So coming to Mr. Eli, I think Ashish had also mentioned the role that is going to be played by technology regulations when it comes to tackling misinformation and disinformation in context of this pandemic. So I think we've already seen instances where many countries have passed new laws, and some existing laws are also being used to sort of criminalize this whole process of spreading disinformation during the pandemic. So I'm just curious as in what is your take on using, say, the criminal sanctions process towards handling misinformation, and or is there like a better way to handle this than this?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think it's a hard one to answer, right? Because every country has such different criminal laws, and in the U.S. civil laws as well. And I think that whenever you start talking about criminalizing speech, at least that makes me uneasy, and I think a lot of people uneasy, because then it really opens up, the potential for abuse, right? Because what I say, if I may believe it, do you want to throw me in jail even if somebody gets harmed? It gets complicated, and so I think there are a couple of things that we may want to consider before we think about sort of criminal sanctions or liability. I mean, I think Facebook deserves a lot of credit for sort of looking at a new governance model to think about how do you combat some of these issues with the oversight board, right, which was launched, a year ago-ish, a little more than a year ago, as sort of a more globally inclusive participatory governance model to sort of, frankly, try to work through some of these really hard questions about what content should be taken down, potentially what should stay up, how do you give people the rights to challenge that a little bit more transparently, because I do think that it's a big challenge when you have a platform that operates globally and every country has different laws. Like, how do you actually then implement laws and give people somewhat equal treatment? That gets really hard. And so I think that we have to look at some innovative models of governance. Perhaps first, governance board's an example. I mean, this conference has spoken about the GIF-CT when you think about extremist content, and there you have a multiplicity of companies coming together, larger and smaller, to think about ways to tackle, again, an issue that could be free expression, or it could actually be harmful content that leads to people getting hurt. And so I think, though, there probably will be extreme cases where you do need to think about, if it's appropriate, criminalizing certain kinds of extreme content, even in the U.S., right? There are certain forms of speech that are illegal and that are, can lead to criminal sanction. And so I think what's the hardest question is, just use the U.S. I mean, frankly, there is misinformation coming from the White House, from the President of the United States on a nearly daily basis about COVID-19, whether it's, potential health cures, which are not, or other ridiculous conspiracy theories that actually harm people. I don't want to inject bleach into myself. I hope none of you do either. But I think that's a really hard example because there aren't criminal, remedies there. And we don't have enough time to educate people how to consume information and use it more responsibly. And so I think that's really where democracies are being challenged. When you have elected leaders who are not taking that responsibility seriously and are still focused on protecting themselves and their political fortunes, and people die as a result. So I think that's the really thorny case, and I don't have a solution there, but I think that's the hard one for the companies and for societies across the world.
Great. Thank you, Eli. And finally, coming again to Ms. Rita. So basically, you spoke about developing new technology to sort of identify COVID cases from voice signature. So I'm just wondering, so what are the kind of privacy considerations that you keep in mind when you're designing a unprecedented sort of a technology solution like this? And are there any specific points that a forward-looking regulation, like you were mentioning, you would like to see it address so that work like this can be enabled and brought to the public faster?
Right, thank you, Arjun. I'll try to be brief on this. So there are data protection and privacy laws in place in every country around the globe. And one of the things that a technology like this, and in fact any technology that is put forth to the world, has to do or keep in mind is to be compliant with all the laws in all the countries. That's a mammoth task in itself. That's an even more difficult task when you have to do it in a short duration of time, when you're under a time crunch, people are dying, there is a pandemic going on. There are still no shortcuts to the data protection laws. Right? They have to be complied with. There are no leeways. There are no leeways for a situation like this. They're not situational. They are applicable to a normal world that is moving at a normal pace. They have not been thought out for exceptional situations. That's one thing that's lacking with the data protection laws. There are another set of laws that have come into play. Those are as I mentioned, the right to be forgotten. That is even more difficult to put in place. Now, in a pandemic like this, and I will shortly get to Eli's and Ashish's points about deleting data, because those points are very relevant to what I'm talking about. So these things in a pandemic situation, when you have the technology, there is AI has been developed a lot in the past years. AI can come to the rescue in many different ways in this pandemic situation. From contact tracing to all the things that are being done in the biological investigation of COVID, AI is being used everywhere. My case is just a small example in the larger pool where AI is coming to the rescue, right? But the laws, the issues that have been raised around AI have now come to bite, and a lot of those have to do with the ethical use of AI and the ethical use of data, and the need to handle data in one way or another under a situation that is not a normal situation. It was not thought about. Now that brings me to the point that I just mentioned, which is, should we delete the data that we acquire during this pandemic? Let's think about it. Should we delete it? Hopefully, and God forbid, such a pandemic never comes along again. This data, we have a set of technologies today that we can apply to this data to learn from it. But who knows, 20 years down the line, we may have a different set of technologies, more powerful, more enabling. Would they be able to go back and study and learn from this data? They should be able to do that. So we should not just have databases, we should have what I call data museums, where certain sacrosanct data should be preserved for the future use of technology. Right? They should be preserved for the sake of humanity, that later on, even if this kind of a thing doesn't come along again, and I hope it does not, we will still continue to learn from it. So these data are very, very precious. Now we talk about, let's take the example of voice data. If I start talking about privacy in the context of voice data, and I assure people that we're going to delete all personal identifiable information from your data, and then we're going to do XYZ with the data. But you know what? A voice is like a fingerprint. The moment I have a database with voice prints and names next to it, it doesn't matter how much I have de-identified your voice, I will be able to identify the person. There is no such thing as privacy when you talk. In the context of voice, people have to realize that there's no such thing as privacy that exists today. Right. So there are a lot of very deep issues that this experience has brought out. And I'm giving this just as an example, realizing that this is just a drop in the bucket and there are many other technologies out there. But so this is what I think I answered. I hope I answered your question, Arjun. I went off on a tangent, but these are very important issues around data privacy that we do need to consider deeply and seriously going forward. Right.
Can I just quickly come in, Arjun? Sorry, Rita. So I 100% agree that, hey, voice itself is a biometric. So you have to remove the voice for it to be personally identifiable. Could there be a solution? And again, I'm not like, I just want to challenge this notion that, we should have this perpetual access to the data. Could there be a model where we can have a reconsent model, right? So we're using this data for this particular issue area of pandemic, and we solve this thing. Once it is done, we'll delete it. But before deleting, can we actually have a model where we get a consent and give control to the user itself, saying, hey, I want to delete it, I want to have it perpetually in a data museum, or I can only use it for whatever purposes. And so essentially bring the reconsent and control in very transparent way back to the user may actually have some legs.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And in fact, we may not need a reconsent for that. It could be factored into the original consent form, whatever we present to them by way of consent form. And I'm sure a lot of people around the world would agree to have their data put into museums, regardless of how personally identifiable that data is. And we're not taking advantage of this altruism around the globe among people, among societies. We should, I think.
Great. Thank you for those interventions. Now I think we're very close to the time that we need to wrap up by. So we have a couple of questions from the audience as well. So I'm just going to quickly put those across to the panel and see if we can take this up. So I think we have two questions, and I think both of them are kind of related. So I'm just going to club them and ask them as one. So Hashri Trivedi asks, like in times like these, how should the safety versus right to privacy dialogue be approached? So I think we've already touched upon in a couple of interventions so far, but if you want to say something more about it. And also a question from Dr. Sami Saran, who asks, like, in your opinion, what constitutes a legitimate state interest for data access? How are companies navigating this across jurisdictions, and how are others responding to this growing data demand from states? So I think this is for the panel in general, but if anybody would like to take this up.
So, Arjun, in terms of legitimate state interest, I think obviously terrorist activity and terrorism would be one such area. I know this conference has been discussing that. So that would constitute a legitimate state interest. Also, during this period of pandemic, what we have seen in this region has been an extraordinary increase in child sexual exploitation. So when you have the misuse of the internet, which happens in terms of different types of crime against children, that would also be a legitimate ground for law enforcement action to go against the perpetrators for such crimes. So these species of serious crimes would, I think, in all democracies, constitute the basis for legitimate state interest. And there are domestic legislations which essentially provide the framework for that enforcement. There is also almost a global understanding in terms of strict enforcement approach to these kind of crimes, even if they are cross-border. When demands are made in these particular instances or these particular cases, you've seen the Christchurch call to action, you've seen the GIFCT forum is there, where you've seen voluntary measures being taken by the private sector, by non-profits, where they've come together in terms of creating a common charter, which also deals with the question as to when it is the right, what is the right framework for state agencies to demand data access and for creating compliance requirements on platforms and others. And in those instances, platforms do comply. I mean, the voluntary digital hashes project, which has been created which is an outcome of these, sort of industry movements, kind of demonstrate the recognition of that principle.
Great. Thank you for that, Ankhi. And I think we have one last question from Richard Chastity for Ms. Rita Singh. So I think so. Richard is asking, so what are the specific examples of symptom metrics that you use in profiling humans by voice? Are those ordinal data only? If you'd like to take this up, yeah.
So what we use for the general profiling, that is for deducing all kinds of parameters from voice that are not necessarily related to health. We use AI-based discovery mechanisms for what we call microsignatures of different influences on the human vocal mechanism on voice. And for specifically COVID and other upper respiratory illnesses, we look at so when you speak, a lot of acoustic characteristics in your voice are a result of your lung capacity or airflow through your upper respiratory tract, and that has an influence on how your voice sounds and various properties of the acoustic signals you produce. So we derive those properties and we study them and we try to find anomalies and microsignatures in those, and we use those to help us discriminate between different conditions of the upper respiratory tract.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that, Rita. So I think those are all the questions I see from the audience, which lines up nicely with our closing time as well. So unless any of the panelists have more brief interventions, I think I will just thank all of you for joining us for this discussion. And this was indeed a very exciting and a very informative discussion.